All right, so in this video we're going to be focusing primarily on prejudice, and this is something that you'll be reflecting on for your final homework assignment. It's also the subject of both of the discussion board reflections that you're going to be involved in. So as I'm going through this, I want you to think about the types of prejudice that you are aware of, and I'm sure there are many more out there that maybe you aren't even thinking about. And then something that you'll be really trying to analyze and describe in your reflection paper is one of your own prejudices and how these prejudices might be shaped and how they might affect you. Okay, so really the focus of this discussion is how prejudice affects us in general. I'm going to touch upon that really lightly, and then we'll talk a lot more about how prejudice develops, and then briefly on how prejudice is maintained within us, and then finally what we can actually do to try and resolve some prejudice. And that's one of the things you'll be thinking about in your reflection. All right, so it's important to be aware of what prejudice actually is. So there's a distinction between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is the affective or emotional component of an attitude that we hold towards members of a particular group. And we hold that attitude based solely upon the person's membership in that group. So if you have a prejudice against people who smoke, for example, even if we're getting to know a particular person, you are going to have both thoughts and emotions about that person simply because you see that they have a cigarette in their hand. And so that's prejudice. I have affective component. It's both the emotional and the cognitive component. Now, if you actually treat them differently, if you speak to them or don't speak to them, maybe you allow them to do something or not, that would be discrimination. And what I'm really focusing here is just the prejudice part, the emotional and the cognitive part. And I have just some graphics here from the Pew Research Center that gives us kind of a snapshot of, I think, what is the prejudice that comes to mind most readily, and that's race-based prejudice. I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that prejudice, we're not always aware of it. It's something that can lurk, I guess, in our subconscious and potentially still impact our behavior, even though we aren't aware of it. And this is something that I know Rebecca Smith brings up in the sociology and the diversity class, something I also like to hit here. Now, as a way to help people assess and understand their own implicit or maybe automatic prejudices that are kind of covert, that we aren't aware of, some researchers at Harvard have created what they call the implicit attitudes test. And one of the videos that I have set up for you to watch is, I think, a Dateline program that shows the implicit attitudes test being conducted with both white Americans and black Americans. And they are looking at white and black preferences that people hold. So I encourage you to watch that video. And what you'll see is definitely a race difference, that white people, when they find out that they have a moderate or strong preference for white people, are typically disturbed by this. We also see that there are black people who show a moderate or strong preference for white people. And not surprisingly, those folks are definitely disturbed by that. What I think students are often maybe surprised by is in the video we also see black people who show a moderate or strong preference for black people. And in that case, unlike the white folks who have a strong own race bias, the black folks who have a strong own race bias tend to see it as something that is a point of pride for them. And I think it's worth considering, why might we see this difference, that an own race bias in white people is upsetting and own race bias for black people is seen as a positive thing? Why is there that gap? Maybe also give some thought to, maybe we can understand why a race would have a bias for itself. Why might some of the black people who are interviewed, why might it be that they have a preference for white people? Why might that develop? And so there's a little bit of discussion on the video, but I also encourage you to give some thought to that on your own. Now I want to speak just really briefly about the impact of prejudice. I could probably talk a whole lot more about this, but I think this really gets more into sociology or anthropology. But really briefly, there's just a couple things I wanted to talk about. And we've discussed this a little bit when we were in the IQ section, when we talked a bit about stereotype threat and how that can impact our achievement and our IQ test performance. Here, I want you to give consideration to self-fulfilling prophecy. And that is that prejudice, even when we are not aware of it, prejudice leads us to treat people differently. And then when we treat them differently, they will typically live up or down to our expectations. And so I have just a graphic here to demonstrate a particular study that was done a little while ago. And in this study, the researchers were observing an interviewer as he worked with black or white interviewees whose resumes, whose accomplishments were virtually the same. And what they saw was when the interviewer was working with the white applicant, the interviewer tended to sit closer, asked more questions, had a longer interview. However, when they were meeting with an equally qualified black candidate, the interviewer, you can see, behaved very differently. Now, if you put yourself in the place of the applicant, how you might react when an interviewer is sitting close versus sitting far away, or having longer interview questions, engaging in more of a dialogue, as he did here, versus just short, tell me your name, tell me what you did with this, tell me about this, and really not engaging in a dialogue. Not surprisingly, what we see is that the applicants behaved differently depending upon the interviewer's behavior. And so the applicant who had this more engaged interviewer was judged by outside observers as being more poised, appearing more competent, and is certainly more likely to get the job. By contrast, the candidate who had this kind of awkward, very short interview experience was judged by outside observers as being nervous and less competent. And so the researchers who are doing this observation came to the conclusion that perhaps it has nothing to do with the actual different abilities of these two men, but that their behaviors are wholly the result of the interviewer's behavior. So then they did a second study. And in that study, they had equally qualified applicants of the same race. And once again, the interviewer purposefully behaved differently. So over here, the interviewer probably didn't realize that he was behaving differently. Over here, there was somebody who was actually in part of the research, and he was purposely behaving differently. And what they saw again was when the applicant experienced a really high-quality, involved interview, he was judged as being very competent, and when you had a low-quality interview, judged as less competent. And so what this tells us, and there are a huge number of results that are probably discussed in sociology class, there's a number of books that have been written about it. There's a book called Freakonomics that talks extensively about how race and just maybe having a black name versus a white name can impact your hiring, your likelihood to be hired. What we see is this self-fulfilling prophecy. When we treat people in a way that suggests we don't have much faith in them, they respond as somebody who's not really worthy of faith. So this is just one impact that prejudice can have on us. I already talked about stereotype threat. I just wanted to bring it up really briefly just as a reminder that when we hold prejudices or we hold stereotypes, the group who's being stereotyped definitely internalizes that, and that impacts their performance. All right, now I want to get into the phenomenon of reverse discrimination, which is perhaps an impact of prejudice that we really don't think about, but still is quite common. And the data that I'm showing you right here comes from a study that I did a while back with some students. And for the study, I had a second grader that I knew write the same story, 2 different copies of it. It was 5 or 6 lines about his pet frog, Bumpy. And what I had him do was to write at the top of it a name and the name of a school. So these 2 writing samples were exactly the same, and I purposefully chose this particular writer because he's a fairly low-level second grader, so I knew that the writing sample would have a number of errors. There were spelling errors, grammar errors, punctuation errors. The story was amusing, but it was certainly not a high-quality piece of work. Now, what I had him do was at the top of one of those writing samples, I had him write his name as Taylor Kennedy, a very white-sounding name. Then he went to Schaefer Elementary, which is in a middle-class neighborhood. In the other writing sample, same exact sample, but at the top I had him write that his name was Deshaun Jenkins, a fairly black sounding name, and that his school was Martin Luther King Elementary, which in Lancaster is in a fairly poor part of the city. And even if you don't know that, typically Martin Luther King Elementary, no matter where you are in the country, is probably going to be in a primarily poor black or Hispanic neighborhood. And that's the case in this situation. Now, the students were, the writing samples were then given to college students, and the college students didn't know anything about the background. They either got Deshaun's writing sample or they got Taylor Kennedy's writing sample. So they looked at only one sample, and they had to evaluate it. They had to give it a grade, basically from 0 to 100, give it a grade on the quality along 4 dimensions: spelling, grammar, writing, and then the story quality. Now, what I want you to notice is that the green bars were the grades that were given to the sample when the students thought it was written by Taylor Kennedy, a white child. And what we see is on 2 dimensions, spelling and then the overall story quality, it didn't really seem to matter whether the evaluators thought that the writer was white or black. However, I think what's interesting is we get into these 2 dimensions right here. The grammar and the writing quality, as I said before, really quite poor. Now, when the students thought that they were reading a white child's sample, they tended to grade it more harshly than when they thought they were reading a black child's writing sample. Same sample, but different expectations. And so when I look at this data right here, what I get out of it is it seems like the college students, who are primarily white, were holding the white child to a higher standard. And they seem to basically be cutting the black child a little bit more slack, which, you hold a certain group of students to lower expectations, they're really only going to perform up to your expectations. And so here we have this self-fulfilling prophecy of reverse discrimination. I don't think you're going to do very well, and so therefore you don't end up developing very much. And so I think this kind of reverse discrimination has some pretty long-term effects on one particular race or one particular group of children. So I think that's something that can certainly go into the IQ and achievement gap that we talked about in the past. Right now I'm going to shift on over to considering the mechanisms that support the development of prejudice. All right, now the first one that I want to discuss is something that I think works in most forms of prejudice, and that's in-group, out-group bias. So this is maybe something you want to ponder. Is this relevant to you as you're considering your own prejudice for your reflection paper? Now, the in-group, out-group bias I talked briefly about when I was discussing the implicit attitudes test, and I said that most white Americans show at least a slight preference or slight bias towards white Americans. And this is also something that I want you to consider as you're watching one of the videos, in particular the blue eye, brown eye experiment that Jane Elliott did. Now this bias seems to probably be part of human nature. It is human nature to form categories, and we will tend to look at ourselves as being a member of one category and then everybody else in another category. So for myself, I fall into the category of woman. And so I'm automatically going to be looking at the world and categorizing people as female or male. I am heterosexual, and so I'm going to categorize the world as being heterosexual, homosexual. We have all of these various group identities that we attach to ourselves, and to a certain extent, we will tend to group the world along those forms of identity, and sometimes that will impact our behaviors towards people in our in-group versus our out-group. In general, what we see is that those people who belong, who we see as members of our in-group, so other white females, other educators, those would all be people who are in my in-group, and I'm going to tend to view them as being stronger, smarter, and more capable than people who would be in my out-group. So that would be males, non-whites, non-educators. And this is a generally automatic preference, but certainly we have the capability of consciously overriding those things and maybe examining them to try to reduce the power that they have on us. Another thing that we tend to see is when we're trying to figure out who is at fault for some kind of problem that we're having in the world. So let's think about right now the economy. Another in-group, out-group that many of us tend to fall into is we might view ourselves as being a member of a political party. So if your in-group is fellow Republicans, you will see the Democrats as being at fault for the bad economy. Or if you are a somewhat affluent person, other affluent people will be in your in-group, and so you will blame the bad economy on people who are poorer. There's a lot of argument right now about the fact that people who make very, very little money don't have to pay any taxes, and there's a lot of anger among people who are wealthy at those poorer people. So poorer people are going to be the outgroup, and so therefore they are the scapegoats. It is their fault that our economy is in trouble. So I've given you a couple of examples. I was talking about kind of this difference between Democrats and Republicans. We also see a lot of discussions between people who are maybe of more middle class wealth versus wealthier people. Another thing that we'll sometimes do, and certainly it's in the news a lot, about terrorists. So we tend to think about us being other, maybe non-Muslims, and them as being people who are Muslim. So there's a number of different in-group, out-groups that we will create. Now, another thing that I want you to consider as being a source of prejudice is something I talked about last week, and that's the fundamental attribution error. So fundamental attribution error, if you recall from before, is that when we are evaluating other people's behavior, we will tend to overestimate the role of internal attributions. And so I said last week, if somebody walks in and they're late, if that person is late, I'm going to tend to blame it on more innate or internal characteristics. They're lazy, they don't have good time management, they don't care about the class. But if I'm late, I'm going to tend to blame it on situational or external variables like traffic or kid was sick or something like that. Now, we tend to extend that to people in our in-group versus people in our out-group. So those folks who are in our in-group, so if somebody is a female white educator and they show up to a meeting and they're late, I'm more likely to be a little charitable with them and assume, oh, it must be something situational, like bad traffic that caused them to be late. If you're in my out-group, you are an Asian man who is in business and you're late, I'm going to assume that it's because you really just don't care about the meeting that we're going to have. So as fundamental attribution error, we will extend it, and it basically causes us to reinforce our prejudice. It reinforces that out-group bias that we have. And so the fundamental attribution error, I think you will also witness that in the Jane Elliott experiment, as well as in the bystander intervention video that I'm having you watch. To give you an example of fundamental attribution error and its role in prejudice, I want to relay a conversation I had with somebody back when I lived in Albuquerque. Now in Albuquerque, perhaps because the sun is so bright, the weather is so great, we had a fair number of homeless people. And quite often a number of these homeless people were Native American. There is a heavy concentration of Native Americans in the Southwest. And I remember walking around this park near our house, and there tended to be a lot of homeless people that were there. And my friends and I were walking, and we saw this cluster of guys who were primarily Native American. And my friend said, yep, see, that's how they are. They, meaning, of course, Native Americans, they're lazy, they just don't really seem to give a damn about their lives, and look where they are. Okay, so here we're seeing this overestimation of innate characteristics. The reason why this person is homeless is because they're lazy, they don't give a damn, and because they are Native American. So she was basically lumping everybody who's Native American into this one group of lazy folks who don't give a damn. Well, we kept walking, and we came across a white guy who was homeless. And I said, well, what about him? Why is he homeless? And she said, well, I don't know. I mean, it could be any number of things. He could be lazy, but probably what happened is he lost his job, or he got into a car accident, he couldn't pay his health bills. There's probably a perfectly good explanation for it. And so here we see that since she's white, she was granting that in-group to this other guy and explaining his homelessness with a whole different set of explanations, much more situational, hospital bills, car accident, that kind of thing, rather than something that was innate. And so that's going to reinforce this negative stereotype of white people deserve the benefit of the doubt, Native Americans are lazy. All right, so that's just an extension of how this phenomenon can contribute to prejudice. Another one of my favorite little social psych phenomena, and this is something that contributes to prejudice, but certainly we see it showing up in a variety of places as well, and that's a need to believe that the world is just, or that the world is fair, and that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, or as I have on here, that we live in a world where people will generally get what they deserve. Now, why might we tend to hold this belief? Well, it's a nice way of explaining things. It's also a nice way to keep ourselves safe. We want to believe that we have some sense of control in the world and control in our lives. And so we want to believe that the world is just. And so if I act the way I'm supposed to, if I behave morally and I behave kindly to people and I treat myself and others with a sense of respect, I'm doing everything I should. And so therefore, only good things should happen to me. At least that's this general sense that we have. And we want to believe that people will get what they deserve. And this also gives us some comfort. And so maybe this other person has been mean to me. Maybe they have violated someone. And so we want to believe that the world is fair. And so therefore, at some point, bad things will happen to that person. It gives us some relief, some security, and I guess also some comfort. Now, this can lead to prejudice because if we see somebody and they're homeless, okay, well, kind of like my friend talking about that Native American homeless person, we want to believe that they deserve to be there. Because if a person just becomes homeless, willy-nilly, with no real explanation, that they don't necessarily deserve to have it happen, like maybe the person who got into a car accident racked up so many hospital bills that they couldn't maintain their home and they got kicked out. If the reality is that good people can have that kind of thing happen to them, well, then what in the world kind of protection do I have? Now, we have this prejudice, so we see people who are homeless, who are down on their luck, and if the world is fair, it means that they got what they deserve. Now, this is one of the nice things about this for us, is that if I believe that this guy deserves to be homeless, he deserves to have bad things happen to him, that keeps me from having any responsibility at all in trying to help him relieve this situation. I don't need to advocate for political policies that will provide a safety net for folks. I don't need to volunteer to help to feed or clothe this man because he deserves the crummy life that he has. But see, if we think that the world is not fair and that he doesn't deserve this, then suddenly that forces me to have to be responsible for him. All right, so believing that the world is fair kind of makes my life a little bit easier. It allows me to sit more easily. And so we want to believe in terms of prejudice that if I see somebody in the hospital with lung cancer, it must be because they have been smoking. And so that kind of helps to create a prejudice in me against smokers. I see somebody who has been having a heart attack and has heart disease and they're heavy. Well, I'm going to think that, okay, that's because fat people maybe deserve to have all these health problems, and so that's going to help to create a prejudice and help to maintain an anti-obesity prejudice in me. It's probably no real big surprise that our tendency to believe that the world is fair depends upon who we are. Those people who are wealthy prefer to believe that the world is fair and that they deserve their wealth, and poor people have done something to deserve their poverty. We see people who live in wealthy countries like the US, like Britain, also tend to think that the world is fair. People who have power tend to believe that the world is fair because, I got my power because I deserve it. You have no power because you don't deserve it. And we also see it varies by political philosophy. So liberals or Democrats are less likely to think that the world is fair than do conservative Republicans. With religiosity, we also see that people who are more religious are more likely to believe that the world is fair. So there's a lot of individual differences in this. All right, now I want to transition over into one thing that I think is really interesting about the belief in the just world, and that is its relationship to rape myths. So we see women who have undergone the horrible experience of rape. And immediately what people will start to do, not all people, but what some people will start to do is to try and explain it. What was she doing that led her to get raped? And we call these things rape myths. So a rape myth would be something like, only women who are dressed provocatively are going to be raped. Only women who are drinking too much, who are dancing provocatively, get raped. If you are walking alone, you're inviting rape. Only, I guess that there's this sort of type of woman who is inviting this sort of violence. And these rape myths are very common. They're commonly held in both men and women. Now, understanding why men might hold rape myths, and again, this gets into this just world belief that the world is fair, so therefore only women who are asking for it are likely to get raped. And if I'm not asking for it, I'm dressed conservatively, I'm not drinking too heavily, I'm not dancing provocatively, I'm going out with friends, I'm safe because the world is fair, right? Now, why might men hold rape myths? Well, to a certain extent for the same reason that women do, but another thing is it does help to justify violent behavior. Even though she said no, I could tell that she meant yes, and so I kept pushing because, come on, look at the way she was dressed, look at the way she was acting. You know that she really wanted it. So it can allow violators to justify their behavior. But I think more provocatively is, why do women hold rape myths? And this is where we really see that just world come in. As a woman, if I can believe that only women who ask for it are the ones that get raped, it gives me this nice sense of safety and security, because if I don't ask for it, I will remain safe. And so we definitely see that just world belief operating here. All right, so that last slide was a slight detour away from prejudice, but still is something that I find very important, and so I brought it up. Getting back to this issue of prejudice, returning to the in-group, out-group bias, another way that we see prejudice developing is we see a lot of prejudice between groups that are competing over scarce resources. And so these two images that I have here are getting at that fact. So we see that there's a movement among particular groups of Black Americans to really push against amnesty for illegal immigrants, in particular Hispanics. And so this is because quite often Hispanic and Black Americans are often in competition for some of our low-wage jobs. And so the idea is, if we are in competition for these scarce resources, I need to band together with other people in my in-group. Black Americans band together with other Blacks. Mexican Americans would band together with other Mexicans. And so there is quite a bit of racial prejudice between these two groups. This is another scene from the Palestinian region. So these would be Palestinian men. You can see they're hurling rocks, trying to hurl rocks over onto Israel. And certainly there's a lot of anger between Jewish Israelis and Arab Palestinians. And they are competing also for scarce resources, land, water, food. Of course, the Palestinians have been walled in, and basically they are walled away from job opportunities, food, fresh water, readily available electricity. So they're also competing for scarce resources, and so they tend to band together very tightly with people from their own geography and from their own religion. I talked about scapegoat theory before. We tend to view our opponents as being at fault. They are less deserving of the resources. So this slide here kind of bands together a couple topics that I've already discussed before. All right, now this is my final slide for the mechanisms that are involved in the development of prejudice. This is probably the most obvious explanation, probably an explanation that virtually everyone can use when considering their own prejudices. So with social learning, we are observing the behaviors of others. We see the prejudice behavior that maybe our parents exhibit, other family members and friends, and of course also the media. And we get a lot of information about in-groups and out-groups and prejudices from the media, and I just gave you a couple samples right here. To a certain extent, there's explicit teaching of prejudice. So this would be if we're sitting around the dinner table and my father is talking about how this Jew at work is behaving. He's so cheap, he's a cheater, he's trying to rob me of some of my sales accounts. If that's how my father is talking at the dinner table, he's making his prejudice against Jewish people very obvious and very explicit. And especially if he tells me, don't ever trust those Jews. That's about as explicit as it can get. And maybe sometimes that can be easy to fight against because it's so obvious and it's so in your face. However, what I think can also be at least as powerful, if not more powerful, is the implicit presentation of prejudice that we aren't even aware of. So if we think about how are black men portrayed in the media, well, commonly they are portrayed as being violent, as being people who are involved in drugs. We see them as being not very involved in intelligent or achievement-oriented segments of our culture. And so constantly pairing this black male figure with other signs of violence and negative attributes, that's certainly going to create a prejudice. Nobody has to actively tell me, oh, black guys tote guns, because the media is basically showing it to me all the time. Something else that we see is what helps to create a prejudice against women to a certain extent, is that we commonly see women being presented in these domestic roles. We never really see men in the media being presented in domestic roles. So it causes us to create a prejudice, maybe that women are only good for domestic roles, a prejudice that men aren't going to be very good at parenting. And so this kind of media presentation doesn't do anybody any good. Muslims, quite often we see them paired with signatures of violence. And this last picture just demonstrates that prejudice can also be a positive prejudice. So we will commonly see Asian Americans as being paired with symbols of intelligence, symbols of achievement, symbols of success. That gives us a positive prejudice, but maybe also is challenging for the Asian person who doesn't really want to do math. So prejudice can also, even when it's positive, can still constrain and pigeonhole us. All right, so I spent the last 20 minutes or so talking about the different mechanisms that are involved in creating prejudice. There are also some cognitive mechanisms that go on to actually maintaining or preserving our prejudice. And so when we've talked in the past about memory, one of the things that I emphasized is that memory is very easy to modify, that the way that we recall information is often not the way it really happened. But it's also the fact that when we encode or acquire information, we're often not entirely accurate then either. So we tend to perceive the world in a slightly different way than it exists in truth, in objective reality. And this contributes to our development of prejudice. So one of the things that we can do is we are inevitably going to encounter people who contradict our stereotypes. So let's say I have decided in my prejudice that all people who smoke are lazy. They are weak-willed and they're lazy. But then I come into contact with a friend of mine who works incredibly hard, is creating his own business to support his family, and he's not lazy at all. So he contradicts my stereotype. But see, what I'll tend to do is when I think about smokers, I will forget about him. Or I will say, well, everybody knows all smokers are lazy, but well, that guy's kind of just an exception. I'm going to minimize the fact that he's contradicting my stereotype. Another thing that we can do is when we encounter things that are contradictory to our stereotype, is we actually alter it in our heads. So I come across somebody who is overweight but is very active. And what might very well happen is when I think back in the future to that person, I might remember them as being thinner than they really were. And so I have altered my perception of that person so as to keep my stereotype consistent. Another thing that can happen is, again, we encounter something that's contradictory to our stereotype, but when we recall it later, and this kind of goes along with the altering the perception issue, we will recall the information in such a way that is consistent to our stereotype. So we can change our memory of things, we can change our perception of things, and we can also just minimize those cases that contradict us. And this all gets into the fact that we like for our beliefs to be consistent. We want to believe that we are right. And so we will tend to minimize or alter things in our world that contradict us. And this doesn't just go for prejudice. This is kind of a general fact in human cognition. All right. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is how we can go about alleviating prejudice. Now, there was a study that was done a little while ago, well, it was actually several decades ago, by Sharif. And Sharif did what I guess is sometimes known as the Eagles and the Rattlers study. It was a kind of a campground study. And at first he tried to create prejudice between two groups of boys. And so this is pretty easy to do in a camp setting. He divided the boys into two groups. There were the Eagles, where's my cursor? There we go, Eagles, you can see on their little shirts, and the Rattlers. And if any of you have been to summer camp, you probably understand that you do start to create this nice in-group, out-group bias with your fellow campers against the campers in another area. We also see this kind of thing, of course, with schools, or if you're on an athletic team, a tremendous amount of in-group, out-group bias. And so in order to create prejudice, he had the boys compete against each other. You can see them engaging in a tug of war, lots of angry curses against one another to compete for prizes. All right, so that was what he did to create prejudice. Then the question is, how do we go about alleviating that prejudice? Well, the first thing that he tried to do was to just bring them into contact with one another. So he had them doing arts and crafts classes. He had them coming to different shows and performances. So they were sitting among one another in the dining hall. They would sit together. But just increasing the contact, that didn't do it. In fact, increasing the contact between them seemed to just create a lot of violence. So they would be pushing and shoving in their arts and crafts classes. In the dining hall, they would be hurling some insults in between each other. And so just bringing people together isn't necessarily enough. So then what Sharif did is he recategorized the groups. He broke down the groups. Instead of the Eagles fighting against the Rattlers, he then recategorized and created Team A and Team B. And so what you see would be members of Team A, and you can see there's Rattlers and Eagles, and they're all on the same team. But then the big thing that he did that seemed to really kind of break down the prejudice was he had them engage in a task where they had to be mutually interdependent. They had to cooperate with one another to accomplish some greater task. So here, Sharif and his researchers told them, you know what, we've had a breakdown in some of the water system here for the camp. We don't have enough people to fix it. It's a fairly straightforward task. How about you boys help us? And so this group of guys right here had to work together on some important task that was much bigger than them of restoring the water supply to the camp. And when they were actually engaged in this kind of cooperative task, he saw that it broke down their prejudices very, very readily and caused them to really start to like and rely on one another. And this general technique has been used in a number of other places as well. So there are groups in the Palestinian region that will have children who are both Jewish Israelis and Muslim Palestinians, and so those kids are working together on these bigger tasks. And the goal is, if they can get those kids to like and rely on one another, hopefully those kids can also help their families to like and rely on each other as well. And I think that the book also talks about some examples where this engaging in mutual interdependence does a really nice job of alleviating prejudice. And so the reflection paper asks you to give some thought on what you might do to alleviate your prejudice. I encourage you to think if there might be any of these things you could do, but certainly also to maybe come up with other techniques you could use. This concludes the prejudice segment. This is certainly the biggest segment for today. And we also are going to have a slightly more positive segment of more pro-social where we're helping other people, and that's the next video.